When the worn, shaking woman came up the road to the Whitfield ranch with half a territory of dust on her hem, Abel Whitfield did not ask her name, or her story, or what had brought her so low. He asked her one thing only: "Can you cook?" And that single question, treating her as useful instead of pitiable, was the first kindness anyone had shown her in a long, hard while. And it was the beginning of how a stranger's worn hands would rebuild a dying ranch and the broken heart of the man who ran it. Abel Whitfield was grieving, and had been for 2 years, and a man can grieve a place to death without ever raising his voice. His wife, Sarah, had been the warm, beating center of the Whitfield ranch. It was her laugh in the kitchen, her good cooking, that drew the hands to a table they were glad to sit at. Her sense that had kept the books and the bunkhouse, and Abel himself, running smooth and content. And then a fever had come through one autumn and taken her in 9 days, while Abel was 3 days' ride away buying breeding stock, so that he had not even been there to hold her hand at the end, had ridden home to a fresh grave and a cold house, and a guilt that never afterward left him. He had not so much as boiled a proper pot of coffee since. The grand kitchen that had been Sarah's stood cold and dusty. The hands, who had once stayed on the Whitfield ranch for years because it was a place a man was glad to belong to, drifted away one by one, not over wages, but over the simple, bleak fact that the heart had gone out of the place, that there was no decent meal at the end of a long day, and no warmth in the house, and no master worth following, only a hollow, grieving man going through the motions in a ranch slowly grinding itself down. By the second autumn, Abel Whitfield had 3 hands left where he'd once had a dozen, a herd half what it had been, and a fine ranch sliding quietly toward ruin while its owner stood in the middle of it like a ghost who hadn't noticed he was dead. That was the ranch the stranger walked into. She came on foot. That was the first thing Abel noticed. A woman walking, which meant a woman who'd had a horse and lost it, or never had one, which meant a woman at the very end of her road. She was perhaps 40, gaunt, her dress mended past mending, her hands shaking either from cold or from hunger or from both, and she held herself with a brittle, exhausted dignity that Abel, in some buried part of himself, recognized. She did not beg. She stood at his gate and asked in a voice worn thin whether there was any work at all, that a woman might do for a meal and a place out of the weather. The 3 remaining hands looked at her and looked away, embarrassed. The country was full of the down and out that hard years made, and there was never enough for them, and a person learned to look away. Abel Whitfield looked at her shaking hands, and out of 2 years of his own buried grief, without quite knowing why, he heard himself ask the only question that came to him. Not what happened to you, not where will you go, which were questions that would have crushed what little she had left, but the one plain question that treated her as a person with something to offer instead of a charity case with nothing. "Can you cook?" The woman went very still. Something flickered behind her exhaustion. Surprise, and then a flash of something fierce and proud. The look of a person handed back a piece of themselves they'd thought was gone. "Yes," she said. "I can cook."
"I can cook better than anyone you've ever sat down to, mister, and I'll prove it for the price of a meal. And you can throw me out after if I'm lying." Her name, she told him later, was Esther Quinn. She had kept house and cooked for a wealthy family back east for 20 years,
until the old couple died within a season of each other, and the heirs sold the house out from under the staff and turned them out with a month's wages and no character reference, in a bad year, with no work to be had. She had spent her small savings and then sold what she owned, and then walked, town to town, looking for a kitchen that needed her, getting turned away, drifting west because west was where the work was supposed to be. She had not eaten a real meal in 4 days when she walked up the Whitfield Road. She told it flat and without self-pity, the way the truly proud tell their worst, and Abel, who knew something about pride and loss, did not offer her any. He just let her into Sarah's cold kitchen. What Esther Quinn did in that kitchen over the following weeks was, the three hands swore for years after, very near a miracle. She scrubbed 2 years of grief and dust out of the place, and lit the great stove that had stood cold since Sarah died, and she cooked. Lord, how she cooked! And the smell of it rolled out across the yard like the first warm day after a long winter. The 3 remaining hands came to that first supper wary and left it loyal. Word got around, the way word does, that there was a real cook at the Whitfield place again, and the hands who'd drifted off began, 1 and 2 at a time, to drift back. Because a ranch with a good table is a ranch a man wants to belong to, and a full crew is a working crew. And the herd that had been neglected for want of hands began, quietly, to be tended again. Esther did not stop at the kitchen. A woman who has run a great house for 20 years cannot help but see what needs doing, and she saw all of it. The books gone to chaos, the larder unprovisioned for winter, the small disorders that a place falls into when its heart stops. She set them right, gently, never overstepping, always asking, and the Whitfield Ranch came back to life around her warm hands, the way a frozen field comes back green in the spring. Within a season, the place that had been dying was thriving. Full crew, full table, books in order, the herd recovering. And Abel Whitfield watched it happen, and watched the woman who was making it happen, and felt something he had been sure was dead in him for 2 years begin, painfully, to stir. He fought it. He felt it as a betrayal of Sarah, to feel warmth toward another woman in Sarah's kitchen, and the guilt of it sent him deeper into his silence. But Esther did not push. She seemed to understand, without being told, exactly what he carried, and she gave him only what she gave the ranch: warmth, and steadiness, and good food, and the patience of a person who knows that some things cannot be hurried back to life. Then the fever came again. It swept up out of the river bottoms in the late summer the way it had the year it took Sarah, and it ran through the bunkhouse like fire through dry grass, and within a week, half the Whitfield crew was down with it, burning and shaking in their bunks. And here the worn stranger proved she was more than a cook. For Esther Quinn had nursed her old mistress through a long, final illness, and she knew sickness, and she did not flinch from it. She turned the ranch into a hospital and ran it like a general, dosing and cooling and feeding broth to men too weak to lift the spoon, sitting up nights, and the Whitfield crew, who might have died, scattered and untended, came through it nearly to a man because of her. And then Abel went down. He went down hard, the fever taking him fierce, and for 3 days he burned and raved. And Esther, who had pulled a dozen men back from it that week, would not leave his side. And in the depths of his fever, in the dark of the 3rd night, Abel Whitfield finally said aloud the thing he had carried silent for 2 years. He thought he was talking to Sarah. He begged her forgiveness for not being there, for being 3 days' ride away buying cattle while she died calling for him, for the unbearable guilt of having missed the one moment that mattered in 20 years of marriage. He wept in his fever, the tears he had never let himself weep awake. And he said he was sorry. He was sorry. He should have been there, over and over. And Esther Quinn, sitting in the dark holding the hand of a delirious, grieving man, understood at last the whole shape of the thing that had been killing him. And she did the only thing there was to do. She held his hand, and she said, low and steady, the words his Sarah would have said if she could. "It's not your fault," she told him, again and again, through the long, burning night. "You couldn't have known. She knew you loved her. You're forgiven. You can lay it down now. You can lay it down." The fever broke near dawn. Abel woke weak and clear-headed into the gray light, and Esther was still there, asleep in the chair with his hand still in hers, worn down to nothing from a week of saving everyone but herself. And Abel Whitfield lay looking at her and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the terrible weight gone from his chest. Laid down at last in the night by a stranger's steady voice, and knew that he wanted, more than he had wanted anything since Sarah, for this woman never to leave. When she woke, he told her so, plainly, the way a man does who has just been close to dying and has no patience left for anything but the truth. "You came up my road shaking and starved," he said, "and I asked if you could cook, because it was the only kindness I had left in me to offer. I didn't know I was asking the woman who'd bring my whole ranch back from the dead, and me with it." His voice was rough. "I heard myself in that fever, Esther. I know what I said, and I know you sat there and forgave me in my dead wife's place, because you understood. Sarah's been gone 2 years, and I've been gone right along with her. And you walked in and lit the stove and brought the whole place back to life. And somewhere in there, you brought me back too." He drew a breath. "I can't offer you what I offered her. That was a young man's whole, untouched heart, and mine's been broken and mended now, and it's not new anymore. But it's real, and it's yours. If a worn-out widower's second-hand heart is worth anything to a woman who deserves a whole one. Stay. Not as my cook, as my wife. Stay, and let me spend what's left of me being glad you walked up that road." Esther Quinn, who had walked 100 cold miles being turned away from every door, sat in the morning light in the kitchen she had brought back to life, and let herself for the first time in a long while believe in a door that would not close on her. "A mended heart's worth more than a new one, Abel," she said softly. "A new one's never been tested. A mended one knows exactly what it's holding on to." Her own eyes filled. "I've spent my whole life keeping other people's houses warm and going home to nothing. Yes, I'll stay. I'll stay, and this'll be my home, and my hands will keep it warm. And for once in my life, there'll be someone in it glad I'm there." "Every day," Abel said. "Every single day." They married when he was strong again, in the autumn, and the Whitfield ranch went on thriving for 40 good years under the warm hands of the woman who'd come up the road with nothing. The hands stayed on for life. The table was always full, and Abel Whitfield, who had once grieved a place near to ruin, lived out his days in a home brought back from the dead by a stranger he'd been wise enough to ask the right question of. Folks asked him sometimes how he'd known, taking in a starving woman off the road like that, marrying her inside the year, And Abel would shake his head and say it had been the simplest thing in the world, really. A grieving man learns to look away from people in trouble, he'd say. It's easier. I'd been looking away from everything for 2 years, my own self included. And then one day, there was a woman at my gate too proud to beg and too far gone to lie. And instead of looking away, I asked her if she could cook. He'd smile. Turned out she could do a sight more than cook. Turned out the worn-out stranger you almost look past is sometimes the one with the hands to rebuild everything you let fall down. Including, he'd say, your own poor heart. I just had the sense that one day, not to look away.